Okay, so if you want to know who is really going to control the future of artificial intelligence, don't look at Silicon Valley.
Right.
And honestly, don't look at Beijing either. You actually need to look at a courtroom in Hong Kong.
Which, I know, sounds a little unexpected.
It does. But today we're diving into why 80% of the world is quietly rewriting the rules of the AI revolution, and they are doing it right under the noses of the major tech giants.
Yeah, it's a massive blind spot in how we talk about global infrastructure right now, because the prevailing narrative is entirely dominated by this idea of a bipolar tech world.
Exactly. We hear about California making a breakthrough, right? And then China making a counter move.
Yeah, and the assumption is just that the future of this world-altering technology is basically an exclusive two-player game.
And that exhausting narrative is exactly what we're dismantling today. So our mission for this deep dive is to explore a completely fresh perspective on the global AI landscape.
It's a really fascinating angle.
It really is. We are pulling from an opinion piece published in the South China Morning Post. This is dated April 25th, 2026. And the author is Brian Y.S. Wong.
Right, who brings a lot of credibility to this.
Oh, definitely. He's an assistant professor in philosophy at the University of Hong Kong, a Rhodes Scholar, and a strategy advisor for the Oxford Global Society.
Quite the resume.
Seriously. And his core argument is that assuming the rest of the world is just passively watching this U.S.-China rivalry is a massive mistake.
But, it is an easy mistake to make if you're only looking at raw computing power.
True.
Because Wong points out a very stark statistic right at the top of the piece. He says that 80% of the world's population is wrongfully dismissed as mere followers with, zero agency in the AI space.
Zero agency? That's wild. Oh, why do they get dismissed so easily?
Well, mostly because of the sheer scale required to compete at the foundational level. The underlying assumption in the media is that middle-tier countries, they just lack the massive research budgets and the critical overhead required to build these systems from scratch.
Okay, let's unpack that barrier to entry for a second. Because we constantly hear terms thrown around like trillion parameter foundational models.
Right.
And I know those are the engines behind the AI we use every day, but practically speaking, what does that actually mean for a country trying to compete? If you don't have a trillion parameters, are you just entirely out of the game?
So think of a parameter as like a single connection, sort of like a digital synapse in the AI's brain.
Okay.
To train a model with a trillion of those connections, you need tens of thousands of highly specialized microchips.
Wow.
And those chips have to be running day and night for months. So that requires billions of dollars in venture capital, a massive pool of elite engineering talent, and, frankly, an ocean of electricity.
That is an insane amount of resources.
It is. And only a handful of corporations in the U.S. and China currently have that specific combination. So the flawed logic out there dictates that if you can't build the brain yourself, you have no power. You're just a spectator.
But Wong completely dismantles that spectator idea. He shares his primary takeaway from the inaugural Hong Kong Global AI Governance Conference, and he introduces this concept that the emerging global AI order is actually a multiplex landscape.
Yeah, and the word multiplex is really the key to his entire thesis here.
How so?
Well, in a unipolar or a bipolar world, power just flows from the top down. A multiplex, however, operates much more like a complex ecosystem.
Okay, an ecosystem.
Right. It's defined by a massive swath of what Wong calls middle powers. These are nations that recognize, hey, we aren't going to build the next dominant foundational AI model from scratch.
They know they can't compete on that specific level.
Exactly. But instead of giving up, they're actively maneuvering to optimize their own unique geopolitical interests against the backdrop of those dominant Pacific players.
I love that. And I want to move from the abstract into the actual strategies here, because if 80% of the world isn't just passively watching, we need to look at exactly how they are asserting this agency.
Right, how they're actually making moves.
Yes.
Exactly. Let's start with the physical reality of AI. Wong highlights the association of Southeast Asian nations, or ASEAN, and he puts a specific focus on Malaysia and Singapore.
They're making huge plays right now.
They really are. They're positioning themselves as critical hubs for data centers and semiconductor manufacturing. But how do they manage to engage with both the U.S. and China without getting crushed by, sanctions or tariffs from either side?
They do it by basically making themselves the indispensable neutral ground for the physical infrastructure of AI.
Neutral ground.
Yeah. We often think of artificial intelligence as something that just lives invisibly in the cloud. But I mean, the cloud is just a massive building full of very loud, very hot computers.
It's physical hardware.
Exactly. And by heavily subsidizing their energy grids, offering tax incentives, and maintaining very strict geopolitical neutrality, Malaysia and Singapore have become the premier landlords for this hardware.
Oh, that's a great way to put it. Landlords.
Right. A Chinese tech giant and an American tech giant might be bitter rivals, but they might both be renting server space in the exact same tech park in Kuala Lumpur.
So if you can't build the AI brain, you own the skull.
Yes.
You own the physical space it requires to exist. And by welcoming investment from both heavyweights, they ensure that neither giant can afford to alienate them without completely disrupting their own supply chains.
That is the essence of a multiplex strategy right there.
Yeah.
You leverage your geography and your neutrality to create a bottleneck that both superpowers simply have to pass through.
That makes perfect sense for Southeast Asia. But what if you don't have the ideal geography or, the cheap energy to build massive server farms?
I think you have to pivot.
Right, which forces a totally different strategy. And that brings us to Europe, because Wong notes that Europe is taking a completely different route. They are plowing ahead with imposing strict guardrails against this immensely powerful technology.
And this is where regulatory power becomes a very real form of geopolitical leverage.
How does that work, though?
Well, Europe isn't trying to be the manufacturing hub, and they aren't trying to be the primary developer. But what Europe does have is a unified block of hundreds of millions of wealthy consumers.
Market access.
Precisely. They are utilizing that market access to dictate how the technology is built. They pass comprehensive legislation, like the AI Act, that sets incredibly strict standards around things like consumer protection, data privacy, and algorithmic transparency.
But wait, doesn't Europe risk regulating themselves into a corner? Like, if their guardrails are too strict, why wouldn't a developer in California or Shenzhen just say, fine, we just won't launch our product in Paris or Berlin?
That is always the gamble with regulation. But historically, tech companies rarely walk away from a market that lucrative.
There's just too much money on the table.
Exactly. What actually happens is something economists call the Brussels effect.
The Brussels effect. Okay.
Yeah, so for a global tech company, it is incredibly expensive and technically very difficult to maintain two entirely separate versions of their AI model.
Oh, I see. Like one for Europe and one for everywhere else.
Right. A European version and then a Wild West version for the rest of the world. That's a nightmare to manage. So mechanically, what do? They just default to the strictest standard.
They bake it into the core code.
Yes. They bake the European privacy guardrails into the foundational code of their global model. So through sheer market gravity, Europe ends up forcing the hands of developers halfway across the world.
Wow. So they are effectively writing the code by writing the law.
Exactly.
But again, that requires a massive unified consumer base. What if a region lacks that massive population but has, say, virtually unlimited capital?
Then you see a strategy more like the Middle East.
Right. The piece moves on to the Persian Gulf states, and Wong mentions they are pursuing highly specialized AI applications in energy, healthcare, and education.
Very targeted sectors.
But then he throws in this caveat that I was really struggling to understand. He says they're pushing into AI despite concerns over water availability.
Yeah, that catches a lot of people off guard.
I mean, I get that they have oil wealth, but why is fresh water a bottleneck for computer software?
This touches on one of the most hidden mechanisms of the AI revolution, which is thermodynamics.
Thermodynamics, okay.
Remember those massive data centers we talked about in Southeast Asia? They generate an incomprehensible amount of heat.
Right, because of all the processors working at once.
Exactly. When you have tens of thousands of microchips processing trillion-parameter models simultaneously, they will literally melt if they aren't cooled constantly.
Oh, wow.
And the most common, cost-effective way to cool a massive data center is through evaporative cooling towers, which unfortunately consume millions of gallons of fresh water every single day.
Millions of gallons, just to keep the servers from melting.
Every single day. And in the Persian Gulf, fresh water is obviously a severely constrained resource.
Right, it's a desert.
So their strategy in the multiplex has to adapt to their environmental reality. They can't just build standard data centers like you would in a cooler, wetter climate.
So what do?
They have to leverage their unique endowments, specifically their immense sovereign wealth and their control over global energy markets. They use that to engineer their way out of the bottleneck.
Throwing money and energy at the problem.
Exactly. That means investing heavily in experimental liquid cooling technologies, or
Yeah.
building dedicated, incredibly energy-intensive desalination plants specifically to feed their tech infrastructure.
That is just a fascinating look at how physical geography dictates digital ambition. The Gulf states are heavily motivated to carve out these specialized AI sectors, and they're willing to just brute force their way through environmental limitations to do it.
They absolutely are.
But okay, we've looked at geography, market size, and capital. What happens when a country's main asset is its diplomatic weight?
That's a softer but equally important power.
Right. Wong brings up a group of what he calls summit conveners. He lists India, France, South Korea, and the United Kingdom. And he notes they have taken on the successive mantle of hosting summits focused entirely on global AI cooperation.
And, we often dismiss summits as just diplomatic photo ops, handshakes and podiums.
Yeah, a lot of talk, no action.
Exactly. But in a rapidly evolving field like AI, the host actually holds immense structural power. It's the psychology of convening. Basically, whoever drafts the agenda dictates the future.
Oh, because they control what actually gets discussed.
Yes. By being the ones who set the table and invite the guests, these nations get to completely frame the global conversation.
I can totally see how that plays out practically. Like if the UK is hosting the summit
Right.
and say that US wants to focus entirely on preventing AI from being used in military weapons.
A very typical U.S. focus.
Right. But the UK wants to focus on copyright law and protecting the intellectual property of artists. Since the UK is hosting, they get to put their priority on the main schedule.
Exactly. They force the heavyweights to engage on the middle powers' terms.
That is so smart.
It is. So whether the focus is algorithmic bias, labor rights, or safety protocols, these convening nations are positioning themselves as the diplomats of the AI age. They are ensuring their specific domestic concerns are elevated to international priorities. Okay, so let's pull all of these threads together. Because we have ASEAN building the neutral hardware hubs.
Right.
You have Europe weaponizing its market size to enforce privacy guardrails. You have the Gulf states brute forcing specialized models despite resource constraints. And then nations like India and France driving the diplomatic agendas.
It's a lot of moving parts.
It's a massive, incredibly complex web of competing and overlapping interests. But that complexity guarantees friction, right?
Absolutely.
With all these different regions pulling in different directions, how do these competing interests actually resolve their differences?
Well, that inevitable friction is the core of Wong's central thesis. Because in a multiplex world where everyone is constantly maneuvering for an advantage, you are going to have collisions.
Think about it. What happens when an AI model trained in California, running on servers in Singapore, violates a privacy regulation written in Brussels?
What a mess.
It is a mess. The developers, the regulators, and the infrastructure providers, they all need a referee.
Enter Hong Kong.
Enter Hong Kong. Wong argues that to remain relevant in this complex landscape, Hong Kong has a very specific strategic opportunity to serve as the nexus of responsible AI governance for the global majority.
A nexus of responsible governance. But why Hong Kong specifically? The piece points to their legal system, noting it enjoys international repute and connectivity because its bedrock is common law.
Yes, the common law aspect is crucial.
Wong envisions Hong Kong serving as a premier mediation and arbitration hub for AI disputes, setting precedents for legal liability and consumer rights.
Right.
But I have to push back here, honestly. Artificial intelligence is evolving by the week. It is completely unprecedented.
It is moving incredibly fast.
So how can a legal system built on common law, which relies entirely on historical precedent and past rulings, how can it possibly keep up with standard setting for a technology that literally has no history?
That is the exact paradox most people struggle with when analyzing tech regulation. It feels completely counterintuitive.
It really does.
But if we break down the mechanics of how common law actually functions compared to other systems, it becomes very clear why it's such a powerful tool for rapid innovation.
Okay, lay it on me.
Let's look at civil law systems first, which govern much of Europe and Asia. Civil law relies on comprehensive, codified statutes.
So written rules for everything.
Exactly. For a new tech issue to be resolved in a civil law system, a legislature often has to draft a massive new bill. Then they have to debate it, amend it, and finally pass it into law.
Which is a process that can take years.
Exactly. And by the time the law is passed, the technology has already mutated 3 times over.
So the law is just always playing catch up to the code.
Always. But common law, which forms the basis of the legal systems in places like the UK, Singapore, and Hong Kong, is largely built on judicial precedent. It evolves case by case, in real time.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So when two tech companies, or say a European consumer group and an Asian AI developer,
Yeah.
have a novel dispute over copyright infringement or algorithmic bias that no existing statute perfectly covers, they don't have to wait for a parliament to pass a new law.
Because they just go to arbitration.
Right. An arbitrator or a judge in a common law system makes a ruling based on foundational legal principles and the closest applicable past cases.
And that single ruling in that single arbitration room immediately becomes the new standard.
It becomes the precedent that future cases will cite. It effectively creates the new rule of the road organically, right then and there.
Wow.
So by serving as a neutral mediation and arbitration hub, Hong Kong can actively shape the global standards for legal liabilities and intellectual property as these disputes naturally arise between all those maneuvering middle powers.
That is brilliant. Because the technology is moving too fast for traditional top-down legislation, the arbitration table basically becomes the actual laboratory where the rules of the AI age are written.
Exactly. And because Hong Kong has this internationally recognized common law framework, a decision made there has immediate legibility and weight for international businesses operating across borders.
So it's a totally service-oriented approach to geopolitical power.
Very much so. While the U.S. and China are spending billions of dollars trying to outcompute each other, Hong Kong is basically offering to build the ring, write the rule book, and supply the judges.
That's a great analogy.
And for the 80% of the world, that global majority that Wong emphasizes, having a neutral, reliable venue to resolve these cross-border disputes is absolutely critical to ensuring they aren't simply trampled by the interests of the two dominant tech giants.
That fundamentally changes how you view this entire ecosystem. And, I want to bring this directly back to you, the listener.
Always a good idea.
Because when we spend time talking about common law, international arbitration, and data center cooling systems, it can sound really disconnected from your everyday life.
It can feel very abstract.
Right. But it's actually deeply personal. Because the next time you use an AI tool, the rights protecting your personal data or the legal liability if that AI infringes on your intellectual property, it might not be decided by a handful of tech executives in California.
No, it might not.
And they won't necessarily be dictated by government regulators in Beijing either.
Right. Those daily protections might actually be mediated by common law precedents set in an arbitration room in Hong Kong. Precedents shaped by this complex, invisible web of global middle powers who all demanded a seat at the table.
It's wild to think about. The product you interact with on your phone is basically the end result of this massive geopolitical balancing act.
It really is.
Which leaves us with a final, lingering question to mull over as we wrap up. If the 80% of the global majority are out there aggressively optimizing their own unique strengths, like if the Gulf is engineering around water limits and Malaysia is hoarding the physical servers and Europe is building massive regulatory walls, what happens when a dispute is so fundamental that it simply can't be arbitrated?
That is the ultimate stress test for the multiplex world.
Exactly. Will we eventually see a fragmented splinter net of artificial intelligence where the technology behaves entirely differently depending on whose sovereign borders your data crosses? Or will a unified, functional global standard ultimately emerge, hammered out case by case in the courtrooms of Hong Kong?
It's the million-dollar question.
It really is. But one thing is absolutely certain. That old assumption that AI is just a two-player game is dead. The audience has stormed the field, and it turns out they are the ones writing the rules.